Hello and welcome to Getting to Know Hue, and this month we are getting to know the color orange. So for this block you need to grab fabrics number 16, 17, 18 and of course your background. So assemble those fabrics and we'll get right at the cutting. For fabric 16 we want to do our cutting again on what is the width of fabric. So grab your fabric and we will just tidy up that rough edge. And for best use of the fabric, we want to cut a 3 5/8 inch strip. Now we're going with the fabric, and we're going to cut one 3 5/8 inch strip and one 3 1/2 inch strip. Go. Let's put the rest of that away for now. Now from the 3 5/8 inch strip, what we want to do first is open it up. Let's get rid of that salvage. And I want to cut two 3 5/8 inch squares. Now I want to cut two 2 7/8 inch squares. So I'm just going to take a 2 7/8 inch slice and another 2 7/8 inch slice. Then I'm going to turn them on their sides and I'm going to square them to 2 7/8 inch square. And the rest of this strip, subcut it down now to 3 1/2 inches. So I'm just taking off a little nub in there. And we want to cut, should be able to get at least two 3 1/2 inch squares from this. And then the strip that you cut into 3 1/2, we need to cut two more 3 1/2 inch squares from that strip. So I'll open this one up, get rid of the salvage, and cut two more 3 1/2 inch squares. Okay, put the rest of that strip back in the bag. We'll use it later. Now, where'd the 3 1/2s go? Take the first square. Fabric 17 is full width of fabric. We don't have a fat quarter of it. So what we're going to do is lay it out so that you have full width of fabric. Now we should be able to get we have to cut a 3 1/2 inch strip, and we should be able to get all 12 of our 3 1/2 inch squares from one strip. So go ahead and tidy up that nasty edge and cut one strip full width of fabric, 3 1/2 inches. Now from this, we should be able to get 12 3 1/2 inch squares, but it might be a little bit tight. So make sure that when you're cutting off your salvage, you're just cutting the salvage so that we have the most usable fabric. Let's get rid of that. And then chop the rest of this up into 3 1/2 inch squares. Now, if you can't get 12 3 1/2 inch squares out of this strip, then don't worry, we will just cut whatever we need out of the rest of the fabric. And I think we're going to be able to make it. There we go. So 12 3 1/2 inch squares, and this is all we have left over. So I'm not keeping that. Now from the remaining, we need to cut a 3 5/8 inch strip. And from this, we're going to subcut that into 3 5/8 inch squares. Now, we really don't need a full strip, but we will use this fabric later on in the quilt. We use this actually, a little bit of it in the star, and we use a little bit in the blocks that go around the outside. So it's okay to go ahead and cut a full width of fabric, 3 5/8. And then what we want out of that is take off the little bit of salvage we have there and cut 4 3 5/8 inch squares. So there's 2, and 4. Now these last 2 squares, the last 4 squares that we cut, the 3 5/8, we're going to go ahead and we're going to cut them on both diagonals. Pop these all off to the side. Label those triangles B. And we can put the rest of this fabric back in the bag. We'll use it later on in the quilt. And finally, well, not really finally because we have our background to cut, but of our colored fabrics, fabric number 18. Now in the book it says cut 3 2 7/8 length of fabric. Now that's assuming that we're starting with a fat 1/8, and we are not. We are starting with a fat 1/4. So lay your fabric out like you normally would with the fabric, and go ahead and cut 1 2 7/8 inch strip. Now from this 2 7/8 inch strip, we're going to cut as many 2 7/8 inch squares as we can get. So I'm just going to kind of open that up because this salvage is a little difficult to see because it's not white, but I want to make sure I get rid of all that salvage. You can see there's like the little kind of holes in there. I want to get rid of it all. And now we can cut this up into 2 7/8 inch squares. We should get most of what we need, but there will be some left over, and we'll have to cut those from the next strip. But let's see how many of these we can get. There we go, not too bad. I got 7, and I need 8. So we're just short 1. So grab your fabric again, and now let's cut a 3 5/8. And from the 3 5/8 strip, what we'll end up doing is cutting 4 3 5/8 inch squares, and then we will cut another one of the 2 7/8. So I don't want to make that too confusing, but we want to use best use of the fabric. So now cut a 3 5/8 inch strip. You can take the rest of that and put it away. And again, I'm going to cut off that selvage. And let's cut 4 3 5/8 inch squares. One wrong. That's 3 3/8. Back to the drawing board. Let's go to 3 5/8. There we go. So those are the 4 squares I need of 3 5/8. Now from this one that was a boo-boo, let's just give it a quick little press. Get that crease out of there. Let's cut a 2 7/8 inch chunk out of it. Like that. Flip it on its side and turn it into a 2 7/8 inch square. There we go. And this piece you can put in the bag. We'll maybe play with it later. Now from those 3 5/8 inch squares that we just cut, let's get them lined up again, because we are going to turn around and cut these on both diagonals. There we go. Grab these triangles. Let's label them triangle B. Stick them off to the side. All right, so now all we have left to cut is our background. And of course, just like every other month, we need 4 of our 13-inch frames and 4 of our 16-inch frames. So grab those. So from my background fabric, I need some 2 7/8 inch squares and some 3 1/2 inch squares. Now I managed to get all the 2 7/8 inch squares from scrap from previous months, but if you can't do that, go ahead and cut a full width of fabric 2 7/8, because we will use the 2 7/8 inch squares in another month. We also need some 3 1/2 inch squares. And if you don't have any 3 1/2 inch scrap, then go ahead and cut a 3 1/2 inch strip. Now I don't have any 3 1/2 inch scrap left, so I'm going to go ahead and cut a full 3 1/2 inch strip. So if you can't get the 2 7/8 inch squares, you need 8 of them from your scrap. Cut a strip, subcut that into 8 2 7/8 inch squares. Then the 3 1/2 inch and an SN, I did have to cut a 3 1/2 inch strip. I don't have enough scrap left to cut 3 1/2 inch squares. Go ahead and get rid of that salvage, and then cut this into 8 3 1/2 inch squares. Now the leftover strip, we will be using that at a later block. So go ahead and just label it and then stick it in the bag once you're finished cutting your 3 1/2 inch squares. So our first step in this block is we're going to make a quarter square triangle. It's kind of like a 4-patch on point. And we want to start off with one A triangle of 16, 2 A triangles 17, 1 A triangle of 18. And we're going to sew these together, so you want to line these up. Raw edges all together, sew down here with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and do the same thing with this one. Line up the raw edges and sew down here with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Now you want to be careful that you don't get the pieces mixed up. So if you take it to the sewing machine and you sew this seam instead of this seam, you're going to have an incorrect configuration. So just watch when you go to the sewing machine that you're sewing the correct pairs together. So this together, and then we are going to sew them together like a little 4-patch. So you want to make 8 of this combination and 8 of this combination. So off to the sewing machine. And here we are back from the sewing machine. Now I do love to strip piece. It speeds up the process just a little bit. The problem with strip piecing is if you're going to do it, make sure that you're getting your first set done correctly. Because with strip piecing, all we do is continue to do exactly the same as we did before. So if we start off with the wrong set, we usually end up with the whole bunch of them being wrong. So you want to make sure you don't do that. So there, when we get this done, you're going to have one like this and one like this. Now, if you go to the ironing board and you press your seam allowances towards fabric number 17 on both of these pieces, you'll end up with a nice opposing seam. So the next step, go to the sewing machine or go to the ironing board, press towards fabric number 17, and then we'll sew these together like a on point 4-patch. Okay, back from the iron board. Now what you want to do is line these together. Make sure all your raw edges line up and sew this with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And you should have those nice opposing seams to help keep that nice and tight. Okay, so back to the sewing machine and make 8 of these. And there we have it. Now, if you need to square these up, they should square up to 2 7/8 inches. So with a quarter square triangle, you want to make sure that you again line up with the diagonal. And on my first cut, I'm doing just a hair over 2 7/8. And you shouldn't be cutting too much off of these. And then flipping it around and lining it up exactly on the 2 7/8, making sure that I'm still on that diagonal. Because of the quarter square triangles, when you're squaring them up, you don't want to take more off of one side or you end up with a wonky quarter square triangle. So go ahead if you need to and square all these up to 2 7/8. And they're pretty darn close. I'm really just kind of cutting off those dog ears. There's really not a whole lot to take off of these. And that's kind of how you want it with your piecing. There we go. So continue squaring those up, and then we'll move on to the next step. There we go. That wasn't too bad. For the most part, all I was doing was cutting off the dog ears, but that's all the fluff I had from the 8 squares. So now that they're all squared up, we are ready to do the next step. So you want to grab one of the 2 7/8 inch backgrounds, and we're just going to attach them, and you want to sew it on to the fabric 18 triangle so that they will look like this. And do that to all 8 of these units. And once you have that sewn on, we're going to press towards this square right here. Okay, so that's it. Back to the sewing machine. All right, now our next step, we are going to make half square triangles. Same way we've always made them. You draw a line on one diagonal. Making sure you're right at the tip to the very tip. And then you're going to sew a 1/4 of an inch on each side of that diagonal. Now this would be a really great time to use that Seams Great tape that we talked about a couple of months ago. Now you're going to make 4 with this combination of fabrics number 16 and 17. And we are going to make 8 with this combination of background fabric and fabric 17. So that's the next step. Back to the sewing machine, and you're going to make 8 half square triangles with this combo and 4 half square triangles with that combo. So when you're done, that will give you 8 of these, 16 of these. So back to the sewing machine. There we go. Back from the sewing machine, I have pressed all of these, everything towards fabric number 17. Now it really doesn't matter which way you push these ones because they don't really butt up against anything else at this point, but still number 17, that way if you have the lighter background it's not going to leak through. So now we're going to square all these little devils up. So we're going to do that in the usual way, and we want to square them all up to 2 7/8 inches. So to square them up, we're going to start. Now the first, we want to make sure we're lined up on the diagonal, same as we always do, and make sure that your first cut is bigger than 2 7/8 of an inch all the way around. So I'm just going to move that down a smidge and take off the nubbins. And then flip it around, do the same thing. Now this time line it up exactly on 2 7/8 inches. There we go. Now do that on all of these ones and all these ones. And then we're ready to actually assemble the block. Oh, not quite. One more section to make, and then we're ready to assemble. There we go. Now that all your squaring up is done, let's grab the rest of our components, and we're going to make a 4-patch. So you're going to put 2 of those and 1 of these. So you want to put those two together, and then sew them together as a 4-patch. And you just want to make sure that the darkest part of the goose is, or darkest part of the half square triangle is all going the same way. So the darker triangle here is pointing in, these two are pointing to the right. You want to make sure that you have this configuration going, and we're going to make 8 of those. So back to the sewing machine. So those two together, and then sew them together into a 4-patch. And then we're done making all the components for this block, and we can start assembling. There we go. Now we are ready to assemble this block. So you want to grab your fabric 16 center square, and we want to put one of these, the 4 patches we just made, all the way around, like so, and like so. Okay, so you're going to start by sewing these 3 pieces here together, these 3 pieces here together, and these 3 pieces here together, and into rows, and then we'll sew those rows together to complete the block. So back to the sewing machine. And there we go. All that's left now is to put the borders on the top and the bottom and the 2 sides and square this little guy up. So again, my block is measuring 12.5 inches. So I'll sew the top, the bottom, and then the 2 sides, and then we can come back and square it up. Now as I'm looking at this, this is a really pretty block. It looks a little different through the camera lens. Got a little hair there. So that's our next step. Back to the sewing machine, put your top and your bottom border on, give it a press towards the border, put your 2 side borders on, press towards the border like we have done every other month. And there we go, another month done. Now I squared these up exactly the same way we've squared up every other month. You want to square them up to 15 1/4 inches. And orange, you glad that we're done this month now? We're ready to move on to the next month. So next month, when we get together again, we've already done purple. So we are going to go ahead, and next month is going to be all about getting to know green. So everybody have an absolutely amazing month, and I will see you next month. Bye for now. Happy sewing.